Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. More bad updates here for Red Bull. We have seen Mercedes talk for the last several years now on their simulation simply not correlating with what actually happens on the track. The simulator says it's going to do one thing, the car actually does something rather different. Mercedes have struggled with this since 2022. Red Bull seems to have it all under control, but apparently not. Since Singapore last year and now continuing into this year, the Red Bull computers do not align with what the RB20 actually does at certain circuits. A major fundamental problem they need to solve and potentially could cost them this year's championships. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. The first thing I wanted to talk about following Monaco though was just the actual Grand Prix itself and general discussions on what we need to do to make it better. Qualifying as always was great, but the race this year was like the worst that I've seen in a very long time, to be honest. Nothing happened. Sure, the red flag at the start didn't help because it took out all strategy, but Monaco in the last 5 years has had 41 overtakes on track. Las Vegas last year had 82, which is literally double. So I feel like Formula 1 sees Las Vegas as their new Monaco. Monaco's always a very historic race. It's also run by like the principality themselves, and you know, Formula 1 don't quite have the control that they might like about it. F1 probably feels that Monaco needs Formula 1 more so than F1 needs Monaco, although maybe, you know, Monaco themselves might disagree with that. Interesting dynamics at play there, but I think there is a trend towards trying to make this a bit better in terms of the racing experience on the Sunday, certainly when the Indy 500 is going on the same day. So what could we do about it, right? Because it's not possible to overtake in normal conditions. Obviously, the cars were driving even at times as slow as, if not slower than Formula 2 machinery, because they simply didn't have to push. There was no overtaking. The F2 race was actually good as well. So I think it does show that, at least, you know, not bad. It shows that when the cars are smaller and lighter and more agile, that is like the number one thing. If we were to drive around Monaco in the cars they were driving in the 50s, it would be a banger, and even 60s, 70s, 80s. But in the last, you know, let's say 15 years, it's not been great. Really, in the last 10 years, I would say, is when it started to get significantly worse here at Monaco, and there's lots of talk as to what we need to do about it. There's discussions on having Monaco be a specific Grand Prix where we introduce other variations. It's not exactly like a gimmick Grand Prix, but we might need to do something to make it more entertaining just for that one weekend if the track is going to stay the same. And the feeling is that Monaco do not want to change the track. That is the track. That's how it's going to be. That is at least the feeling. So Marko says, and we'll talk about more what he says here in a second, the simplest thing would be to change the track. We'll discuss in a second. There's also the possibility of mandating pit stops. To be honest, I would be in favour of this rule anyway, when every driver on every team has to run the soft, the medium and the hard compound during the Grand Prix. I think that would be a great rule change that would make almost every race more entertaining, especially for the standard one-stops, as Monaco typically is, and basically always is unless there's some crazy rain scenario in play. So maybe you do that just for Monaco. There's also people that say just use soft tyres and have like only softs be allowed on that weekends, because they're not going to last the whole Grand Prix. You're going to have to pit once or twice to probably twice to actually make that work. So there is some talk about that. Obviously, if the cars were smaller, that would be the primary solution. And even Lewis Hamilton mentioned this and said that what if we make it 3 mandatory stops or just something to spice up the Grand Prix? There is talk, of course, about the track. We're actually back on Google Maps here. Pretty rare, but of course we did this when Adrian Newey was spotted over there in Bologna. This is Monaco. This is the hairpin, of course, the famous hairpin. We go round the corner, we get to Portier, and then we go through the tunnel. Now, the general theory on what you could change if you wanted to is, instead of going right at Portier and then straight into the tunnel as it is here, you instead go left first, round another roundabout to just extend the distance, because the one overtaking point on the track is after the tunnel, down the hill, into the chicane. That is the heavy braking zone where an overtake is very unlikely but still possible. There's another spot at the end of Sector 1 which is also possible, but really that's where you've got to try, after the tunnel down the hill. Now, if you have higher speed going into that braking zone, it creates a heavier braking zone, more opportunities to make an overtake there, and that would happen if you had a longer run into the tunnel. There's also possibilities of, could you have DRS in the tunnel? Maybe that's a bit risky, but with these ground effect cars, I think it's certainly possible to do. And this is what I think Gary Anderson has recommended before, is, as I'm saying, basically, instead of going right at Portier, you first go left round a roundabout. Now, it's possible you could go immediately around a roundabout there and then have an extra, let's say 50 meters onto this straight. Or instead, you go a long way out all the way to this roundabout, potentially with DRS here, then into the tunnel. So I think that is the theory, that maybe extending the run on the run into the tunnel is the way to make things more entertaining, and it's certainly possible to do. The problem is that I don't think Monaco want to do it. They like the track as it is, and they wouldn't be wrong if the cars were different, but the cars are what they are, and they're probably not going to get massively smaller anytime soon. So that was just a quick analysis really on what Monaco might have to do to make things somewhat more entertaining. Plenty of other stories around the world of F1. This is even in NASCAR, but Tony Stewart and Gene Haas, they're selling and shutting down their NASCAR Cup Series operation after 15 years. I think this is because Tony Stewart's off doing other things really now, and Gene Haas has said this doesn't change the commitment to Formula One. So, interested to hear what you think about that, just because Haas, we've talked about, is he going to sell, especially because Andretti might come in and pay big money. Now this operation is shutting down, but if anything, this might strengthen his commitment to Formula One, and especially with the way the team has improved this season, it kind of vindicates maybe his idea to get rid of Günther Steiner and say, no, actually, look, we can achieve more on the same investment, whereas Günther was like, look, we need more money if we want to achieve more. And you can argue that it's just because Ferrari have got better, why Haas are better this season, but nonetheless, I'm sure Gene Haas feels rather satisfied with this decision as it stands. Speaking of the driver drama, Liam Lawson seems very unlikely now to be going to RB. As time goes on, they're obviously happy with Yuki Tsunoda, and the issue is for Lawson that Tsunoda is not going to get called up to Red Bull. For whatever reason, even if I think that's a bad idea, they're not going to do it. And I think that at some point, Tsunoda will look elsewhere, maybe even as soon as next season. But AlphaTauri or RB, they will keep Tsunoda on, and they seem to like Ricciardo. He's not driving incredibly well, but he is still a good marketing tool, basically, and he's at least acceptable enough. So that means Liam Lawson probably isn't going to get a drive there, even if he might deserve it. So he's got to look elsewhere, which makes him a really interesting contender in the driver market, right? Because you then look at Haas, you then look at Williams, especially because Ocon is linked to Haas, Zhou is linked to Haas, we've got, Sainz is linked to Audi and also to Williams. So where are these drivers going to end up, right? And if RB stay as they are, where does Lawson go? Because you'd feel like he probably deserves a seat. Williams might make sense. But, what if Sainz wants to go there, or something else happens, or Antonelli goes there and somebody else goes to the Mercedes? It's all a bit of a mess, to be perfectly honest. Alpine themselves, this is kind of wild, are in talks with none other than Flavio Briatore, who is this fellow, of course, if you guys aren't aware, current manager to Fernando Alonso, but of course was integral to multiple scandals in Formula One history, not least, of course, Crashgate, when he was with Renault in those Singapore days in 2008, which of course now is Alpine. Now, he wouldn't be returning as team principal or any sort of real role like that in the day-to-day, but he'd be returning as some sort of consultant to the team. So I find it pretty wild. I mean, this guy's actually allowed back in the paddock, is he now? Yeah, fair play. He's still friends with everyone in Formula One. Yeah, certainly a character, if you guys aren't familiar with Flavio, but he's apparently in talks with Alpine. So what's going on at that camp? I have no idea. There's also talk, actually, just before we get onto the Red Bull stuff, on Ocon and Gasly, because Ocon, it's been rumoured since the Grand Prix after the crash, they were going to drop him. And if they don't now drop him, then it's well, if they back down, they backed out of it, a bit pathetic, isn't it, type thing. So I don't really know if they'll think about that publicly, but they may enforce what apparently has been called a non-aggression pact, where they're not allowed to crash into each other anymore. So, yeah, the rumour is that Ocon will not be dropped for Canada. Surely they should have done this a while ago, because these guys have been coming together for some time. I think it was very well known before they became teammates at Alpine that this was probably going to happen. They've had drama in their past, and it ain't going away. French drivers in a French team, it was always going to be fireworks, and here we are. Whether they're going to do what Mercedes did to Rosberg and Hamilton back in 2016 when they said, look guys, if you crash again, you have to pay for the damage, I don't know if that's a solution here, but apparently Alpine will prevent further incidents, but there's surely only so much they can do to prevent stuff. But let's talk about the Red Bull, because they're not in a great spot, Red Bull, surprisingly, given how the season started. They're talking about the crash damage as well, and effectively saying, Red Bull and Helmut Marko, that if there's another crash for Canada or beyond, especially in Canada, they simply won't have enough parts, because they've manufactured new upgrades to Imola, and over the last couple of rounds of races, as have other teams. The big crash in, of course, Monaco has destroyed Perez's entire car. That costs money. That means that upgrades being brought going forward, as we discussed yesterday, become more of a challenge if they suffer further damage because of the cost cap, but also they might simply run out of new manufactured parts. Like, if there's a Canada crash, they will have to go back to older spec versions. And let's be real, Verstappen will keep all the newer spec stuff, and Perez might not have it. Even if, let's say, Verstappen was to get into an incident or something, that's just how it would be at Red Bull. But still, the point is there that they're on the verge of being in a bit of a predicament right now. And even in, the drivers, fair enough, Verstappen's probably still got enough lead to win, although it is still early days. In the constructors, it's very much all to play for. Like, they're at 276 this year compared to 321 last year. But Ferrari are just so much closer this season. And Aston aren't there to take points off those guys as they were last season with Alonso. And of course, now McLaren have made the progress, and RB have made the progress since, of course, leaving as AlphaTauri to become the new team. So it's all rather remarkable, and Ferrari are massively bullish on their prospects, especially because going into Monaco, the weaknesses of their car were sometimes in the slower speed corners. They weren't optimal, and neither were McLaren, to be fair, but they've gone to Monaco and Ferrari have dominated there. So now they're thinking, wow, is our car even better than we thought it was? Is it a setup thing we adopted? Is it that massive barn door rear wing they put on that's giving them the edge? But now they'll go to Montreal and Barcelona just to kind of clarify exactly how good their car really is, and they're feeling that it might even be better than they thought it was. And Fred Vasseur is now saying that every single weekend there's going to be a battle. Many teams, including Red Bull and Mercedes, are saying, and even McLaren, Red Bull are still the team to beat. Let's see how they fare on normal circuits. They might still be half a second ahead. But Fred Vasseur doesn't think so. He says, look, there will be circuits that favour one team over the other, as we've seen over the last few rounds, but that difference will be a tenth, maybe a tenth and a half. So his feeling is that even when we go to a Red Bull favoured circuit, let's say such as the circuit to Barcelona, Catalunya, whatever it's called, basically the Spanish track that is obviously well known, and Red Bull have dominated there the last couple of seasons. Mercedes tend to be good there as well historically. Fred Vasseur believes the gap that Red Bull will have, if there is one, won't be as big as we've seen in the past. So there's lots of confidence there. Obviously, we saw this crash the other day from Sergio Perez, which has affected many things, and also is involved in what we're going to discuss with the simulator here in a second. The other point that I wanted to make on this, because this was an incredible photo of the moment where he hits the wall, and you can see all the debris flying everywhere. And this is by design, right? The Formula 1 cars are designed to basically explode when there is a crash, because that dissipates the energy. And this is what we have seen over the last few years, that the cars are now bigger, they're heavier than they were before, and as a result, when they crash, there is more energy dissipated. To protect the drivers, the car needs to basically break apart. And this is good to protect the drivers. What it does mean is you get things like this when these photographers, one of them got injured and I think had to go to the hospital and thankfully is okay. But these guys are standing here taking photos of this crash and knowing that they are in the firing line here and they have to get the hell out of the way. And they do, but look at all the debris going everywhere and people get injured as a result of this. So that is the concern that many have, certainly at circuits like Monaco, street tracks, especially when the spectators, the photographers, are very close to the actual circuit themselves, is that sure, the drivers might be benefiting from the much greater, and obviously the drivers are fundamentally at risk being in the car, of the safety advancements made, but because the cars are so designed to protect the drivers for all the massive amount of energy that are dissipated during a crash nowadays, because the cars are so much heavier than they were before, it's actually putting spectators and maybe, cameramen more at risk than before because of the nature of how things are going. So, just another reason basically to make the cars smaller and lighter, which I will keep banging the drum of that one. But let's talk about the other piece of the puzzle for Red Bull, because not only did the crash do a lot of damage to the car and to their budget, but also they don't know about the gearbox and the engine, because presumably the gearbox and the engine are totaled, right? So not only does that mean they've got to be replaced and that costs some money, but also it means they've probably lost a gearbox and engine in the contact because the rest of the car's destroyed, and that probably means that you've got to put another one in at some point, which means a penalty. So, look, Perez isn't going to win the championship anyway, so it's not like this is Verstappen getting a gearbox or an engine penalty that he will have to take, but it's quite likely that Perez will. And that could obviously affect their results in the constructors. Like, if Perez has to take a 10th-place penalty at some point for a new engine that other guys don't have to have because of this crash, that's a rather big deal when it comes to the end of the championship standings and results. But this is their main problem, Red Bull, is that their car isn't driving as it should be. We have thought, and it's been theorized, understandably, that Red Bull's simulator works perfectly well, because Mercedes have talked about it pretty much since 2022, that their W13 Zero Pod concept was meant to be a second lap faster than the other version that they debuted at Spain for the pre-season testing that year. And it didn't obviously happen. The car wasn't good because when it was getting so close to the grounds, it started porpoising, and it's still a problem that Mercedes are dealing with to the present day of simulating the performance of their car when it runs very close to the ground over bumps and stuff like this. It's a very difficult mathematical equation to solve. Mercedes have struggled with it. I think they've even brought in someone from Ferrari who does their simulator stuff to see if he can help them out. But Red Bull are actually saying, yeah, we kind of have the same thing in certain situations. Helmut Marko says, in the simulator, we can drive over the curbs without any problems. Maybe not Marko himself, but, like his drivers and test drivers and stuff like this. Here, let's use Verstappen's expression, the car hops like a kangaroo. Going on to say, this is actually not brand new. Simply put, the simulator and reality do not correlate. Monaco was not the first racetrack where we had this problem. It was the first time that it was relatively severe was in Singapore. So they didn't say this after Singapore last year, Red Bull. I don't believe they did anyway. Obviously, they struggled there over the bumps and the curbs and stuff. Their car wasn't working well. We thought it might be the new technical directive, but that turned out not to be the case because they dominated again the next time out in Japan. But at certain tracks where the conditions are tricky and the curbs and the bumps on the track are difficult to, render in the simulator, the car doesn't perform as expected. And this is probably true to some degree with every team, that it's not going to be a perfect correlation, but the closer it is, the better, because then you actually understand your car. And they're saying, yeah, Singapore last year, it was dodgy, and we haven't fixed it. The simulator still says something that doesn't correspond to reality. That is the first point we're going to address, but they've still got to figure this out, right? We're optimistic we can find out why the simulator produces data that doesn't correspond, but Montreal could be a difficult weekend, because Red Bull seemingly have had the knack of turning up to Grand Prix tracks, putting the car on the track, it works as expected, the setup their simulator conked out, basically spit out for them, works, and they dominate the weekends. Nowadays, Red Bull are going to turn up to Canada and think, well, is what this simulator says really true? Like, is the car actually going to perform as it says it will? And that puts them on the back foot. That means they've got to change setup. They've got to try some different things to get the car in the best spot. And maybe that's not enough when it comes down to qualifying on the Saturday. So there is clearly a fundamental problem. And maybe this was what Adrian Newey was talking about, right? When he mentioned after his retirement in Miami, obviously his retirement from, Red Bull as a team rather than his retirement from the race or anything, because he wasn't driving. Obviously, he was their former technical director now, or chief technical officer actually. But now he's gone. He said that there was one feature of the RB20 that he didn't like and the team didn't like either. And we kind of speculated what that might be. But maybe this is it. That over the bumps and the curbs, the car just doesn't really work. And maybe that's a sacrifice that needs to be made. And maybe when we go back to more conventional circuits, they'll still have the fastest car. I feel like they probably will. But for Montreal, that's pretty bumpy sometimes. Obviously, going over curbs and stuff, you have to take a lot of curb on certain corners at Montreal. And when Verstappen was trying to take curb here in Monaco, it was just not working at all. So fascinating to see how this one trends going forwards. I know even that Martin Brundle was talking about the fact that is it possible those internal dynamics, the breakdown between Marko and Horner and even Verstappen and Jos Verstappen and all the internal parties has had a part to play in this recent breakdown of form. I don't know, I think we need more time to determine whether that's true or not, but I would say that it's not impossible that what we're seeing behind the scenes has had some part to play in what's actually happening on track themselves. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final interesting stat here that Daniel put out there. The last time that all of Verstappen, Hamilton and Alonso were all outside of the top 5 was back at China 2016, so a long time ago. Monaco this last weekend that happens, but of course last year all 3 of those guys shared the podium time back in Canada, when I think that was actually when Aston brought their first upgrades that apparently weren't working properly, but it was still good enough for Alonso to have a great result. Max, of course, won the race, and Lewis was there as well. So we shall see if there's any kind of history repeats itself here and these guys can get back up top. But yeah, Aston Martin certainly on a massively downward trajectory. Same with Mercedes, but and maybe even same with Max Verstappen and Red Bull, right? So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.